multiple victims, gunshot wounds.
I thought, oh my God, I'm gonna die.
Being affected by gun violence welcomes you into a family.
I was afraid that he would realize he didn't kill me and he would come back.
It just feels like this happens over and over and over again, rinse and repeat.
A mass shooting in Monterey Park.
There are now 2 fatalities from this Saugus High School shooting.
An active shooter for a time at an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas.
Firearm violence is a public health crisis.
Ban assault weapons now!
We must stand up and stop the constant flow of gun control bills.
My son was murdered. He was taken out of this life for no good reason.
Firearm is not a bad thing. It can be an evil tool, or it can be a lifesaver.
Enough is enough!
My generation is not sitting on the sidelines, and this is what gives me hope.
Hello and welcome to an LA Times Today special. After Monterey Park, the impact of gun violence on our communities. I'm Spectrum News 1 anchor Lisa McCree.
And I'm LA Times columnist LZ Granderson. It's been more than 2 months since a gunman entered a Monterey Park dance hall, slaughtering 11 people and wounding 9 others. It is one of California's worst mass shootings and one of more than 100 in the U.S. so far this year.
In 2021, the rate of Americans killed by a gun was the highest in 30 years. Gun-related deaths are now the #1 killer of children in the U.S. And during the first week of March, the U.S. broke a record, a grim one, a total of 100 mass shootings.
On this episode, we'll talk to victims and survivors of gun violence, the ER doctors who call it a public health crisis, and citizens who are buying guns to protect themselves.
We'll also talk to people who have the power to do something. And we'll start with California Representative Judy Chu, who is also the former mayor of Monterey Park. Congresswoman, it's nice to see you again. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You were there with President Joe Biden last week in Monterey Park as he went to console the community and also to announce an executive order on gun violence. You said that the community members contributed ideas. What in that order would have kept your community safe?
The biggest one was regarding the red flag law. This was a shooter that was becoming increasingly mentally unstable. He had, in fact, gone to the local police and said that his family was poisoning him. He also became increasingly isolated. The dance studio provided support, but he moved about an hour away, so he didn't have that support anymore. And so somebody in his circle should have seen that he was deteriorating mentally and that he was accumulating ammunition because he had hundreds of rounds of it. And so the red flag laws could have addressed that, but I doubt that anybody in the immigrant community even know that they exist.
And just to remind people, a red flag law is when a family member, a coworker, an employer, a teacher, someone who lives in your household can report you to authorities if your behavior is disturbing, and they can take away your guns and ammunition temporarily.
Yes, and this executive order will enhance the outreach that these red flag laws are done to different communities. We're also going to push that there is multilingual outreach. The other thing that it does responds to what the community said were problems after the mass shooting, and that is that there was so much confusion and frustration and not a lot of coordination between the different agencies. And there really were mental health resources that were needed, but that coordination wasn't there. So President Biden said, after a natural disaster, FEMA coordinates everything. And what we need is a FEMA-like response to a mass shooting so that everything is indeed coordinated.
When I think about President Obama, President Biden, President Trump, executive orders is something that comes up over and over again, and they all say they need Congress to pass something. We have a divided Congress today. That's not really going to happen. But what do you anticipate happening in 2024 in terms of the political rhetoric and how politicians will be campaigning about gun laws in the next election?
Well, executive orders are so important because they can be implemented right away. But we do need change in our laws, and I think the most important one is a ban on assault weapons. I know that President Biden reiterated that when he came to Monterey Park last week.
And I'm determined, once again, to ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines.
I think that the cry for a national assault weapons ban needs to be implemented. And there are more and more communities across the nation that are saying this must be done. So actually, the cry is getting louder and louder. And by the way, if we had this assault weapon ban, it would have stopped this shooter because he had a high capacity magazine that is illegal in California, but that would have stopped a lot of the carnage, I should say.
Let us rededicate ourselves today to making this law become the life of our country.
The assault weapons ban during the Clinton administration was very effective. Mass shootings plummeted, but it only lasted about 10 years. And the gun lobby, so richly funded, does not want to see it return.
The gun lobby is something that has influenced Republicans for such a long time and stopped them from ever doing anything that would be forward-looking on gun control. But I tell you, what we need is an infrastructure that's just as strong, and we're developing that. There are gun safety groups all across this nation. I'm just amazed at the proliferation of them, and they have joined together in a very strong coalition. Politicians need to see is that they will lose votes if they do not support more gun safety measures, common sense gun safety measures like universal background checks, which has been proven to save lives. We need to close the loopholes on just those. 90% of Americans support this. So this should translate to votes for elected officials, no matter what their party.
Congresswoman, before we let you go, I want to make sure we don't forget about the people and not just focus in on the politics. How is your community doing? How's Monterey Park doing?
They had a big hole in their hearts, which had yet to heal. That's why when President Biden came, it went a long way. They're still grieving. They are immigrants from China, Vietnam, Taiwan, and the Philippines. They worked hard to build their lives here, and they did not deserve to be taken from us. So President Biden talked about his own experiences with death of his loved ones. And the gun victims were so very moved by his words.
Congresswoman Judy Chu represents Monterey Park in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you.
When it was time to transport the Monterey Park victims, there was little doubt many would end up at County USC Hospital. It is one of 5 Level 1 trauma centers in LA County and the only one in East Los Angeles. Its staff is considered one of the most experienced in the nation at treating trauma injuries, including gunshot wounds. So when the victims began arriving on Saturday, January 21st, the triage team was ready. The hospital gave us rare access to witness an all too typical shift in the trauma unit.
It doesn't have to be a Saturday night. There's been Mondays, there's been Thursdays. I've had a Thursday that's worse than any worse Saturday that I've ever had. Trauma does not discriminate. USC base.
Yeah, let's go County Base Rescue 10 with the notification.
Rescue 10, go ahead. My name is Alma Blunt Aviles. I'm an assistant nurse manager in the emergency department. I don't remember exactly the specific time of the incident, but I do remember that I was rounding and checking certain things in other parts of the department. Our department is very large. We do have phones that we call VoIPs, and on those phones we get alerts that basically said we have this type of person coming from a multi-casualty.
You have 10 unresponsive inside, and you have 2 that are still in critical condition and breathing.
We prepared for 10 because that's what we initially thought we were getting. We ended up getting 4 within a few minutes of each other, and a 5th one later came about 45 minutes to an hour after.
We are a level 1 trauma center and the largest trauma center in California. And the hospital is prepared to deal with these mass casualty events. So from the medical point of view, it was not a challenge. It's more the psychological, the emotional impacts which had on our staff.
The impact of that specific incident just got bigger and bigger as the day went on, you know, and then you start kind of painting the picture of we're a part of that.
I actually operated on one. Yep. Well, I helped them operate on one of the most critically injured. They did not make it. As a trauma surgeon, you don't remember the people you save, but you always remember the people you lose.
Trauma centers, it's a major investment for the public. If you get a bad injury, your chances of survival are about 25% higher if you are taken to a good trauma center. Very often police officers and paramedics know that. And they said, if I get badly hurt, shot, take me to the USC County Hospital. And the reason for that is that we have a huge experience, and many of the concepts in the management of these gunshot injuries, which are now national standards, came out from this hospital, from research from this hospital.
We can get up to anywhere from 4 to 8 gunshot wound victims. It all depends. It all depends. It's very random.
Last night when I checked, we had 6 gunshot injuries in the hospital. These patients stay on average maybe 7 to 10 days hospital stay. Very often they stay for months.
It costs a tremendous amount of money to take care of the patients in the hospital. But I think one thing that people fail to discuss is because it's disproportionately affecting young folks, you also lose out on productivity of our young people.
All vitals have been stable on scene. He's starting to come to more, answering more questions appropriately at this time.
We've had a significant increase in the amount of gunshots and stabs, but mostly gunshot wounds, patients that we've been treating. And I think one of the strangest things is even during the pandemic, that rate continued to pick up.
In the emergency department, the number of gunshot injuries seen increased by 68%. And the number of deaths in the last 5 years increased by 93%. And this is the tip of the iceberg because a lot of these patients die at the scene. They never make it to the hospital.
I think violence, especially firearm violence or stab or wound violence, is a public health crisis. And we don't treat it that way. And I think violence should be treated just like we do high blood pressure, like we do diabetes, like we do cancer.
It's an epidemic. It's not a problem, it's a major epidemic, and people need to know that, and the society and the politicians and the leaders need to decide which way to go. Do they want this to continue, or do they want to do something else?
It is probably fair to say that gun violence is something we all expect to happen, just not to us. It happens to other people.
That's what many of the people you're about to hear from also believed. They are the victims of gun violence. Here, in their own words, what life is like after the shooting stops.
The ranks of this club that nobody wants to be in, it's getting bigger. And as we get bigger, the voices get louder. Change takes time, but we're not giving up. I mean, I'm not giving up. This is the right thing to do. So we just keep at it.
Telling you this story now, you know, it's been 20-some years, but it's still fresh. I'm a pastor, and I received a call at church. I was leading prayer that Monday evening, and the woman said, "There's been a shooting that involved your family, and we need you to come to Darby Park." The commanding officer gets there, and he says, "So, how old was your oldest son?" And I said, "He's 7. And he said, "Well, he didn't make it."
August 10th, 1999. I got a page that my husband was trying to reach me. There's somebody with a gun at the Jewish Community Center. 6 and 8-year-old boys had been shot. And my boys were 6 and 8. We were incredibly lucky that our son was shot twice. he would survive. I was shot in the Santa Monica College mass shooting. I don't know if you all remember that one. 10 years ago, I'm driving down Pico Boulevard in Santa Monica, and I saw somebody in all black and a ski mask and everything with a rifle. So I put on my gas, and that's when he started to shoot all across my windshield and got about 30 shots into the car. I was the only survivor that day.
I was caught in the crossfire of an argument coming back from the grocery store.
Every day I walk into school really early because me and my friends love to talk before class. And while I'm talking to my best friends, I hear a bang. Another bang came and I found myself on the ground. I had been shot.
To be shot, it's instant pain, burning. Your life flashed right in front of your eyes.
I don't remember thinking, this is the end.
The day that they told me that I wasn't going to be able to walk again, it crushed my soul.
This may sound, stereotypical, but honestly, I thought, did I say everything I wanted to say to my children and to my husband that day? And when I realized that I had, I was able to relax.
I was thinking, I'm only 23 years old, I can't die yet.
The first time I saw a gun was when I was 5 years old. My biological father threatened to kill my mom, and he pulled a gun on her. And we luckily called the cops. He ran away as soon as police arrived. A lot of times you don't hear about it in the news where a gun is used in a domestic violence situations, and it does become fatal sometimes.
My wife, Christy, was killed in a mass shooting in Orange County. The shooting was October of 2011 in the city of Seal Beach, which today still stands as Orange County's largest mass shooting in history. Every time we have one of these, it consumes my whole body and soul, and it just wants me to shut down like I did that day.
Me and my father, the night of his passing was one of the rare nights that I actually went home that night. He told me, "Good night, I love you, I'll be home in about 30 minutes. I was with my grandmother when I found out. It was thought to be a robbery. Police do believe that he was on his knees when he was shot and killed. And I feel a lot of sometimes guilt for it because I just know that that wasn't the best way a human should have died. But I know my father fought very well to the end of his life.
It does make me frustrated when in communities like mine there is day-to-day gun violence and you don't hear about these violent incidents, right?
Josh received gifts and letters and phone calls from literally around the world. And I remember even at that time feeling bad, thinking, my God, there's people who are having to endure this alone at their dining room table. There's nobody coming. You're doing this alone.
If I were to try to calculate a number of individuals, people of color, black men, the like, who have lost their lives to gun violence since my son, I was always fairly good with math, but I couldn't give you an accurate number.
We're considered another statistic. This is terrible. It's not right.
There's long-term trauma that goes with any of these incidents. You'd think 20 some odd years later I could talk about it and not cry, but I can't.
There's no set schedule for us to be on to heal.
Why does this keep happening?
We just say again, it could never happen here, that wasn't me, that wasn't my child.
Gun violence is a nonpartisan issue. It's going to affect you one day. We aren't just a number. We are real people who are being affected by gun violence every single day, so the number keeps rising.
It's so important that survivors be seen. We were victims, but I call myself a victor now because I have overcome, and I refuse to allow the atrocity of mass shootings and murder take my mental state, take me out. Everybody has to care on some level. It may not be the thing that you champion, but you have to care. It has to matter. It has to matter.
An increase in anti-Asian hate crimes has led to a surge in gun purchases among Southern California's Asian American and Pacific Islander community.
LA Times reporter Jung Park spoke to firearm buyers and sellers and discovered that for some, feeling safe means owning a gun.
Arcadia Firearm and Safety is located in the heart of LA's Asian community, San Gabriel Valley.
好，然后你今天想买什么枪？
我也不太懂呢，您给介绍介绍。
OK， 最多人常用的枪是 Glock 19。
哦，
因为很多 Glock 19。
More people in my store, they come in, they have been a victim, either be burglarized or their business have been broken into or their car broken into. And we see the numbers growing.
I haven't ran into anybody that I know that said protecting myself is wrong.
45 miles away in San Bernardino, members of the Asian Pacific American Gun Owners Association are meeting for a day at the range.
There you go. You said you grew up in Taiwan. What was the reaction from your family like when you had told them that you bought your gun?
I think the first reaction is that, is it safe? But they understand that gun is very, is common in the States.
Do you encounter people who are against the goal of your group?
So for Asian Pacific American gun owners, APA-GOA, no. Like we're not saying every person should own a gun. We're not saying every Asian Pacific American person should use a gun for self-defense. We really are just saying, make sure you are using your firearm safely and responsibly. And if you have made the decision to purchase a firearm, if you already have a firearm, we want to be that resource.
Let me ask you about the last two mass shooting, Monterey Park, Half Moon Bay. I think that has led more people to talk about gun control. What's your reaction when you kind of hear that debate?
Gun control is not controlling the criminal. And first of all, that shooter, they have mental problem. I don't see how any law can control mental people.
Talking about that Monterey Park shooting, that kid that actually shot the shooter, he actually took away the shooter's weapon to use against him. Firearm is not a bad thing. It can be an evil tool or it can be a lifesaver. It just depends who's holding that tool, who's holding that firearm.
And reporter Zhang Park joins us now. Welcome, Zhang.
Thanks for having me.
So, generally speaking, when we talk about ethnic groups, we like to group them all together, particularly when we talk about the electorate. But there are some variations within the Asian American community when it pertains to guns. Could you talk a little bit about that?
That was one thing that really fascinated me when I was reporting this piece for print and for TV. Filipino Americans, for instance, their homeland, the Philippines, is a country where guns are less regulated and where guns are more widely used. So Filipino Americans have more familiarity with guns, and that carries over to the US, and they're more likely to use a gun for sport, for hunting, for different purposes. That compares to Korean American, where I come from. Even though guns are used in Korea as part of a compulsory military service for men, it's really highly regulated. No Korean male other than those in the military really have a gun. So that carries over to the US, even though you may remember the rooftop Korean, that was more for business owners who were trained in using a gun, but who are not using a gun in their everyday life.
You're talking about the 92 LA riots.
Yes.
Yeah, and those people were trying to defend their stores, and we saw those pictures, and it gave us sort of a distorted view of what the gun population might be within that community.
Right.
You spent a lot of time at that gun range and the gun store talking to people. Tell us what was motivating them to buy guns. Was it the recent spate of shootings, or was it anti-Asian hate that we saw rise? Was it fear?
It was a lot of different factors. I think the gun store owner that we talked to basically said that everyone who wanted to get a gun had already bought a gun. So the recent mass shootings in Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay were not as much of a factor when it comes to driving the first-time gun purchases. However, anti-Asian hate that has been going on for the last couple of years of the pandemic.
Asian Americans are tired of living in fear and being frightened about their kids or elderly parents going outside,
as well as the general feeling of feeling unsafe in different cities across California and the country, have contributed to this rise in gun ownership among Asian Americans.
One of the things I found interesting in your reporting was the secrecy that's within the Asian American community when it comes to gun ownership. Where does that originate from, and is it tied to generations?
It is. I mean, first generation, they again come from a place where guns are not as familiar to them in their homeland. And they come here and they feel like, they don't understand why people need to have a gun. That's different from second and third generation who grew up in the U.S. where they're surrounded by gun culture. So no matter their political ideology, they are more familiar with guns. So there is a little bit less of that secrecy. However, depending on where they work in, if they work in tech industry, or where they work in the field where political ideology may be a factor, that could lead them to be more secret about their gun ownership.
Zhang, thanks for being here. Zhang Park covers the Asian community for the LA Times. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
It's a stunning and shameful statistic. Gun-related violence is the #1 cause of death in children in America. Every year, approximately 19,000 children are killed or injured by guns, and another 3 million are exposed to gun violence. Their stories are heartbreaking, but they share them because they're fighting for change.
My name is Mia Tretta, and I'm a wounded survivor of the Saugus High shooting, November 14th of 2019. There are so many can't remember every single shooting. The shooting happened in 8 seconds. I got up and I knew that my stomach was wet, and I knew that my leg felt tired. I was able to get myself up and run away. I ran to my favorite teacher's classroom. Later that day, I found out that my best friend was killed.
When people ask me what happened to my father, I oftentimes just say he passed away, or, oh, he's not in my life at this moment, but I don't want to give the description because then it just brings you back to that, and then it's just all you think about, and it really does ruin your day. My father had been staying very late at work. Next morning came, and my mother hadn't talked to my father since the previous night, so she called him and no response. My grandma called the police, and they finally made their way in, and they realized that he had not left the location at all because he was in the back of the store, deceased. It was a gunshot wound to the head, the back of the head.
We were at home in South Central Los Angeles, and I just remember screaming and shouting, which is something that I was already used to at 5 years old. But what was different about this was that my mom was really insistent on leaving. And so there was an incident where my biological father hit her, and then he pulled out a gun and he wanted to kill her. I just remember hiding with my sisters and my brother, being scared, and that event is something that I try to forget.
Gun violence touches so many different parts of you. Healing from a mental injury and not being able to go to school because it doesn't feel safe anymore. A place where my childhood was ripped away.
For a child, it's most definitely confusing. We can't comprehend a reason why someone decided to take someone else's life with a gun.
Gun violence is the leading cause of death among children in the United States, and that's terrifying.
My generation is the mass shooting generation. We're the school shooting generation.
We shouldn't accept that as our fate. I hope my generation is angry enough to do something about this. I really hope so. I really hope so.
Natalia Jackson joins us now. Natalia, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You travel the country. You want to wake people up to the realities of gun violence. And you do that with your story, which is emotional. You lost your dad when you were 5 years old, but you also do it with data.
Yes, I do. Every day, 90 people are killed or just simply affected by gun violence. As of March 16th of this year, there has been 8,618 deaths caused by gun, whether that is at-home suicide or kids getting access to it, whether they think it's in a safe location or not. They do get access to it, and as of now, there's been 113 mass shootings. either targeted or not. That number includes kids from the age of 6 to 13. And the numbers beyond that are from ages 14 to 18 and above. And it's really shocking to me to believe that a child my age can get a hold of a gun, and whether they're the one perpetrating the evil act or being affected by it on both ends, it's just a very sad event to take place. And probably by the next minute, it'll be different.
Why do you keep these numbers in your head? We just saw in the piece that you said talking about losing your father ruins your day, but you keep checking these numbers every day. Why?
You know, that's a very good point. It does ruin my day, and it does shift my mood and my perspective, but it's also like there's a slight feeling of hope inside of me, and it's like when I check those numbers, it's just holding on like, okay, there's some change going, I'm making a difference, I'm using my voice, and, all of this has happened. There has to be, the numbers have to be going down. But then every day I check, it's kind of just a rude awakening to realize even more that there is a problem in America with gun violence. So I do check, just like, come on, it has to be different, but also it's just like, this is why I do what I do.
We hear again and again that your generation is going to be the generation that does something to curb gun violence.
Yes. I'm from the south side of Chicago, where 4 years ago, I woke up to gunshots and police sirens, and 4 years later, I wake up to gunshots and police sirens. Where 4 years ago, I was burying my friends and family to gun violence, and 4 years later, I'm still burying my friends and family to gun violence.
That's a lot. Do you ever get angry that that's put on your generation?
I do, because it's not fair that my generation, Generation Z, is a generation of growing up in an era of mass shootings and school shootings. At such a young age, we have to endure learning about active school shooting drills. And even some of us have experienced hand-on shootings, and that can leave trauma, extensive trauma for a very long time, leading to anxiety and depression. And the number of children with anxiety and depression, it has grown intensely. Those are also numbers that I check on a daily basis, and I don't even have to check the numbers to be aware of it. I can just simply look at my friends, family members, anyone that surrounds me that's of a similar age group as myself. I can see that they're struggling. So it does make me a little angry that adults can't understand why we act like it, but we can't understand why someone is doing what they're doing with, guns and killing innocent people.
Real quick, your conversations with your friends, do you talk about mass shootings? And if so, what are those conversations like?
It's a very hard conversation to bring upon. I don't want to be the Debbie Downer of the group, but I also want to be that person that can inform my friends that, hey, this is the problem, and it may not seem like it's affecting us. It's not happening at our school, but it's affecting our community. It's affecting our legislation laws. It's affecting things that are going around us. So I want to be able to inform them on a very positive note and tell them, if you're interested, this is something we can do to make a change. We can have a voice, even though we're quite young, but also it's a very tough conversation, especially knowing I've been personally affected. I don't want to make it uncomfortable, but I know it's a conversation we need to have.
Natalia Jackson, advocate for gun control, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you both for having me. I appreciate it.
We spent the past hour looking at the short and long-term impacts of shootings in our community. What realistically can be done to stop gun violence?
To help answer that question, UCLA law professor Adam Winkler joins us. He is a constitutional scholar and an expert on gun policy, and is the author of Gunfight: The Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America. Professor, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You wrote an extensive paper called The Reasonable Right to Bear Arms. What is that, and could we get there?
Well, in the paper, I show that Americans have long respected the right of people to have firearms for personal protection, but at the same time, we've always had gun regulation. If we go back to the founding era, when the Second Amendment was first written and adopted, the framers had gun safety laws. And I think many people in America believe that gun control and gun safety and gun rights are all incompatible. But I think the history and tradition of guns in America shows that we can have gun rights and good and effective gun safety laws.
Professor, it's interesting that you say that, because we know from history that the NRA actually was working hand in hand with the federal government to write some of these laws. Can you walk us through how we got from where the NRA was working with the government with gun rights laws to where they are today with lobbying?
Anti-gun, anti-freedom politicians are shamelessly and illegally using the awesome power of government to trample those rights.
The NRA was not always the die-hard opponent of gun control that it is today. When it was started over 100 years ago after the Civil War, it was about training Americans to fight with firearms. And indeed, in the 1930s and 40s, the NRA was responsible for writing many of the gun laws on the books that today's NRA tries to fight and says are unconstitutional. Everything changed in the 1970s when the NRA had a literal revolt at the annual membership meeting, and a bunch of hardliners took over the NRA and recommitted the NRA to hard fighting political advocacy rather than its traditional focus on outdoors activity, hunting, and target shooting.
Yeah, and the money that the NRA puts into lobbying politicians pretty much guarantees that we're not going to see meaningful gun legislation passed at this time. A lot of people point to the next generation, saying they're the ones who are going to send lawmakers to Washington who want sensible gun control. But you cover the Supreme Court in your lectures all the time. As long as that conservative court is in place, will any gun legislation stand?
Well, I'm certain that the Supreme Court will uphold some gun regulation, but it is a real problem confronting gun safety advocates right now. If we look around the country now, it's quite a startling list of gun laws that have been declared unconstitutional just over the last 6 to 9 months. Bans on possession of firearms by domestic abusers, bans on guns in churches, hospitals, and bars, even summer camps, prohibitions on firearms in the hands of people charged with felonies, and prohibitions on guns with obliterated serial numbers. So we're seeing a real revolution in the courts, sparked by the Supreme Court's decision last June that expanded Second Amendment rights. And those justices on the Supreme Court are going to be there for many years to come.
Is there an angle to this conversation that we're not cognizant of? Is there a piece of legislation that you know that's in the pipeline that, we haven't discussed yet?
Well, of course, there are innovative ways to think about gun safety reform. California recently adopted ammunition background checks, the first in the country. California was a leader on things like red flag laws, and California has been a leader on removing firearms from the hands of people who are prohibited from having firearms, but nonetheless still do. The problem with all of these efforts is that the Supreme Court has said that the only gun laws that are constitutional are those that are similar to the gun laws in effect in the 17 and 1800s. And so any new innovative law seems not only certain to be challenged, but likely struck down too.
We know that those gun laws that have been put in place in California have worked. In spite of the shootings at Half Moon Bay and Monterey Park, we know that we have a lower per capita mass shooting rate here in this state. Yet those laws are being challenged in court. If California's gun laws are struck down, what happens next?
Well, I think that we'll see spikes in gun violence. It's absolutely true that California's gun laws are relatively restrictive. But relative to what? Relative to Texas and Mississippi, yes. Relative to most of the Western industrialized world? No, California has some of the loosest gun laws in the entire world. Several of California's innovative gun laws are currently pending before a federal judge in San Diego, Roger Benitez, who has a long history of striking down California gun laws.
I am very cautious when it comes to attacking judicial decisions, but I sat back and watched decision after decision after decision with Judge Benitez. He's unserious.
If he rules that California's ban on assault weapons or high-capacity magazines or ammunition background checks are unconstitutional, that will lead to unquestionably an appeal to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the federal appeals court. And that court, it'll take about a year for that court to rule on the constitutionality of these gun laws. And depending on how that court rules, we could see some of these gun laws go to the United States Supreme Court. So Judge Benitez won't be the final word on California's gun laws, but he can certainly make it so that California's gun laws on the innovative side don't get put into place and become effective for many years to come.
Adam Winkler is a professor of law at UCLA and the author of Gunfight, the battle over the right to bear arms in America. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank all of you for joining us for this special edition of LA Times Today. I'm Elsie Granderson.
And I'm Lisa McCree. We leave you tonight where we started, in Monterey Park. This is video from the first Sunday tea dance at the Lai Room since the shooting. People here told us that getting back on the dance floor is an important step in their healing process. Good night.